Today, we will be exploring the rise of international terrorism. We will focus mainly on nationalist terror outside of the US, mostly in the Middle East, with the rise of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, after discussion of the historical background of the conflict there. As we saw in the readings and recent lectures, Jewish migrants to the Middle East joined a small native Jewish community there. Throughout the early 20th century, but especially in the years leading up to World War II, the Jews of Palestine, who numbered over 500,000, agitated for statehood. This movement is referred to as Zionism. Jewish neighbors in the Middle East, the Arabic-speaking population, feared a Zionist state and its attendant loss of privileges and rights, and opposed outright the plan to grant Israel statehood. In this, the Palestinian Arabs were supported by most Arab leaders of the neighboring countries, notably King Farouk of Egypt and King Abdullah I of Jordan on the east bank of the Jordan River. The United Nations, newly formed after World War II, found itself tested early on by the Israel question. Originally, Israeli territory was to be a shallow U-shape of land in what was formerly British Palestine, mainly in areas where Jews were in a clear majority. That's shown on the map on the right in green. This territory, as proposed by the UN for the Jewish homeland, was neither satisfactory in terms of size nor defensibility from the Jewish perspective. Nonetheless, the Jews accepted the general framework of this agreement. Their Arab neighbors, however, did not. The founding of Israel unilaterally in 1947, with U.S. backing, made that country a U.S. ally, a decision which has greatly shaped U.S. policy and the region itself. In 1948, the Arab nations of Transjordan, now modern Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, fought the forces of Israel for 9 months. At the end of the conflict, Israel was a decisive winner, seizing a large amount of territory from the Palestinian Arabs and forcing hundreds of thousands of Palestinian Arabs from their homes. King Abdullah I, the great-grandfather of the present-day King of Jordan, lost out on his bid to dominate the Palestinian Arabs, although he, like many Arab leaders, never recognized any nationalist aspirations to the Arabs of Palestine. As a former president of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, the father of the current president of Syria, Bashar al-Assad, once remarked to Yasser Arafat, "Remember, there is no Palestine, there is only Syria." By this, Assad meant that in Arab thinking from the medieval and early modern era, the entire eastern coast of the Mediterranean, from Turkey to Egypt, was called Syria. Thus, the countries of Syria, Lebanon, parts of Iraq, Jordan, and Israel all belonged historically, geographically, to Syria. The point here is that conflicting notions of heritage, geography, ethnicity, and the claims of certain groups to the land are historically contingent and are far more complicated than they appear. However, we can't really understand any of this conflict without understanding the politics of the Cold War. In the 1950s and 60s, great changes were afoot. In Africa and the Middle East, decolonization had begun. World War II had left the major colonial powers of the region exhausted. The U.S. supported most nationalist movements against their former British and French allies because the U.S. feared that not to do so would throw these movements and the states they hoped to found into the arms of the Soviet Union. Indeed, this is exactly what happened in places like Egypt, where the Egyptian revolution of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Egypt had been nominally independent since 1922, but in fact it was under the dominance of the threat of British military intervention. This occurred when, in 1956, Western governments, especially the United States, refused to fund the proposed construction of the Aswan High Dam in the Nile Valley in southern Egypt. President Nasser, who had seized power in a military coup and remained officially neutral in the Cold War to that point, turned to the Soviet Union, who lent Egypt the money to build the dam. In 1956, Nasser attempted to nationalize the Suez Canal, which led to an armed intervention by Britain and France. the two principal shareholders of the canal. They were joined in the fight by Israel. Under intense pressure from popular protests at home, French and British forces withdrew after a negotiated settlement that reopened the canal, while the Israelis were the last forces to leave. The incident cost thousands of lives and left Egypt embittered, with only a Pyrrhic victory to show for their trouble. The Suez Crisis made it impossible for the U.S. to sell arms to Egypt and forced President Nasser closer to the arms of the Soviet Union. The Suez Crisis was also Britain's last war in the Middle East until their first Iraq War, and it marked the end of more than a century of British domination as an imperial power in the region. Surrounded by hostile neighbors, none of which would recognize Israel's right to exist, much less its statehood, Israel began to prepare for the inevitable next conflict. In the meantime, both King Hussein of Jordan, who had acceded to the Jordanian throne in 1952, and Egypt were determined to wipe Israel off the map. Lebanon had never ceased its hostilities, and Syria and Iraq remained dedicated to the destruction of the Jewish state. Saudi Arabia, although it shared no border with Israel, supported its elimination, as did most other Arab states throughout the region. If we turn east, we find that another key component of the Middle East struggle, and one that is in the news today, is Iran. In 1953, the United States and Great Britain orchestrated a coup against Mohammad Mossadegh, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran. Mossadegh intended to nationalize British Petroleum's interest in Iran, arguing that Great Britain was making hundreds of millions of dollars from his nation's oil wealth, but paying only pennies on the dollar. This, of course, is true. With British interests so threatened, the British acted with American support. Because Mossadegh was not sufficiently anti-communist, the American government favored his removal and replacement with a more reliable client ruler. They found this in the form of the Shah, the hereditary ruler of Iran, whose power had been displaced by a new democratic constitution and reformers who aimed to make Iran more open, modern, and independent. The CIA engineered Mossadegh's overthrow and replacement of a democracy with the absolutism of the Shah, Reza Pahlavi. The Shah of Iran became a loyal U.S. ally and staunch anti-communist. Iran was the strongest and most important ally of the U.S. in the Middle East. The U.S. could not, however, stabilize the region, which was increasingly important because of its oil wealth. U.S. oil imports continued to grow throughout the 1960s. Saudi Arabia and Iran, both U.S. allies, were rapidly becoming wealthy as petrodollars flowed in. Arab nationalism was at an all-time high. Led mainly by Egypt, Pan-Arabism, a movement that dreamed for the unification of all Arabic-speaking countries in a secular and religious state, was prominent among Arab leaders and nationalists. President Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president of Egypt, was the foremost among these Pan-Arabist leaders. Egypt even briefly merged with Syria to create the United Arab Republic from 1958 to 61, a move intended, ironically, to counter communist influence in Syria. This is obviously rather funny, since Washington viewed Egypt as a natural ally of the Soviet Union and pro-communist. In fact, Nasser intervened in Syria because he was afraid that the communists would take power there. In reality, then, Egypt was an ally of the Soviet Union by necessity, not by choice, and because it was on the wrong side of the Israeli question. Only Egypt's hostility to Israel, counter to U.S. interest, kept it out of the pro-Western, pro-capitalist camp of the Cold War. Throughout the 1960s, Nasser and King Hussein of Jordan supported guerrilla groups in the West Bank in Israeli-occupied Palestine. These so-called Fedayeen commandos were guerrilla troops who frequently attacked Israeli forces and settlements in acts directed against both military and soft civilian targets, in acts of terrorism designed to pressure the Israeli government, to keep tensions high, and to keep the Israelis off balance in the occupied territories. In 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, was founded in Cairo at the 1964 Arab League Summit with the backing of most Arab leaders. The express aim of the PLO was to eject Zionists from the region and for the Palestinians to be able to return to their homeland, since hundreds of thousands of them were now refugees in neighboring Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. The 1960s witnessed the decolonization of Algeria, where the French were forced to quit the country after a brutal and bloody civil war. Although rarely learned about in America, the French war in Algeria resembled our slightly later involvement in Vietnam. Just as the U.S. in Vietnam, the French at one point had over 500,000 soldiers in Algeria. Despite the Herculean effort, the FLN guerrillas and the French public opinions spelled defeat for the French and the end of their rule there. Bolstered by their success in the Suez Crisis, in the liberation of Algeria, and with other Arab countries basking in newfound oil wealth, Pan-Arabism and Arab nationalism were riding at an all-time high in the 1960s. It seemed like only a matter of time before the Israeli question would be resolved. By 1966, Egypt, with the largest population and army in the region, and its allies Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon were preparing for war. A Syrian radio broadcast of 1966 stated, quote, "We have decided to drench this land with our blood, to oust you, aggressors, and throw you into the sea for good," unquote. Nasser moved 100,000 Egyptian troops into the Sinai and kicked out the United Nations Blue Helmets, the peacekeepers who had been deployed there since the Suez Crisis to maintain the peace. Syria moved 75,000 troops to the border north of Israel, while Jordan deployed 55,000 soldiers and modern U.S. supplies tanks and artillery along the eastern border with Israel. On May 27th, Nasser stated, quote, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight," unquote. On the morning of June 5th, Israel launched a surprise aerial attack, sending all its operational jet aircraft into the skies. They flew low over the sea to avoid Egyptian radars, sweeping both over the Mediterranean and Red Sea before attacking their targets, the Egyptian Air Force, which was neither prepared for the assault nor bunkered. The results were devastating. Egypt's Air Force was crippled in the first hour. 236 of 420 Egyptian aircraft were destroyed on the ground, while the Israelis lost 13 planes. Israel would have air superiority for the rest of the war. Israeli forces advanced into Sinai, attacking Egyptian forces through the desert when the latter believed that the main Israeli assaults would come down the major roads into the peninsula. When fighting ended on June 10th and a ceasefire was signed by all parties on June 11th, Israel's victory was total. Although outnumbered and fighting on multiple fronts, sometimes against opponents with superior weaponry, the Israeli Defense Force had humiliated their foes. Arab states were shocked to the core. Jerusalem, prior to the war, had been a divided city, like Berlin, and it was quickly now made a Jewish capital, following the Jewish occupation. The West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Gaza Strip were all
annexed.
The Six-Day War, as the 1967 conflict was called, left indelible marks in the region. Egypt eventually relinquished its territorial claim to Gaza, and Jordan eventually did the same with the West Bank. The Golan Heights were annexed by Israel, while Syria views these as part of its territory and remains at war. Jordan, convinced that it would not be able to defeat Israel militarily, and that it was not in the interest to continue its hostilities, instead allowed the PLO to usurp its place among the Palestinians in the West Bank. The PLO, led from 1969 by Yasser Arafat, who had founded Fatah, one of the PLO's member organizations, was named leader of the Palestinians. King Hussein watched the influence of Arafat and the PLO grow within Jordan, which was poor, and a poor and weak country that had to cope with hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees, most of whom refused his offer of Jordanian citizenship. In the late 60s, the PLO acted virtually independent of the Jordanian government, a state within a state that relied on international Arab leaders for money, arms, and support, a situation that King Hussein found increasingly intolerable. In 1968, another militant wing of the PLO, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a leftist organization with Marxist-Leninist ideology led by the Palestinian Christian doctor George Habash, hijacked an Israeli El Al flight from Rome and diverted it to Algeria. After more than a month of negotiations, both the hostages and hijackers were freed. Such political efforts were broadcast around the world on the growing global media of television, for which such spectacular acts were tailor-made. Habash, a communist, and its PFLP was a Marxist group, with backing from the Soviet Union and their proxy states, and these aimed at a revolution within Jordan. On September 6, 1970, George Habash's PFLP planned and orchestrated one of the more daring terrorist attacks in history: the simultaneous hijackings of 4 airliners headed to London and New York. PFLP members attempted to hijack Israeli El Al Flight 219 from Amsterdam, but Israeli guards thwarted the effort and captured the Palestinian hijackers, killing one, Patrick Arguello, and the other, a female hijacker, Layla Khaled, whose photogenic looks and brash, unapologetic manner would make her an international icon of terrorists and resistors around the world. 2 of the jets were forced to fly to Jordan, where they landed in the desert at an old RAF airfield called Dawson's Field. The 3rd jet was diverted first to Beirut, then Cairo. It was wired with dynamite and blown apart on the runway, although all the crew and the hostages escaped harm. 2 days later, on September 9th, PFLP sympathizers hijacked a British airliner flying from Bahrain and diverted it to Dawson's Field. King Hussein of Jordan watched helplessly as the world media broadcast pictures of the Western airliners and passing camels in a surreal scene. He and his country were humiliated. The crisis deepened. On September 10th, King Hussein's forces engaged PFLP fighters in the Jordanian capital of Amman, where the PFLP were holding hostages at the Intercontinental Hotel. Hussein watched helplessly as the Palestinians at Dawson's Field blew up the hijacked planes, emptied of their hostages on international television. Meanwhile, the PLO declared the northern Jordanian city of Irbid liberated, and thus declared a full-scale civil war and its intent to overthrow Hussein and turn Jordan into a Palestinian Marxist state. On September 16th, King Hussein declared martial law and began a military offensive against the Palestinians. In the ensuing violence, the hijacked passengers were moved around Amman and were in great danger. Hussein's troops defeated the PLO's Fedayeen guerrilla fighters. Fighting was intense. Several thousand Palestinian civilians were killed and an unknown number of PLO fighters, probably around 1,000. 2 weeks later, the hostages of the 4 airliners were returned to their respective governments in exchange for the hijacker Layla Khaled and the former other PFLP terrorists. Jordan, who had confronted its internal threats and proved victorious, was now more than ever drawn into the U.S.-Israel orbit against its Iraqi and Syrian neighbors, who remained Soviet clients. Members of Fatah, Arafat's militant wing of the PLO, founded a terrorist organization in 1971 named Black September to commemorate the defeat at the hands of Jordanian forces. Black September conducted the kidnappings and killings of the Israeli Olympic team in the 1972 Munich Olympics that you will learn about in the documentary One Day in September. International terrorism was the result of Palestinian efforts, and they and their Middle Eastern compatriots, such as Abu Nidal, would dominate the international terrorist arena in order to publicize their cause throughout the 1980s. Yasser Arafat led the PLO into southern Lebanon, following his defeat at the hands of Jordanian forces. Arafat and the PLO sparked the Lebanese Civil War, in which multiple groups battled along sectarian and nationalist lines. Eventually, Syria occupied most of Lebanon, and the PLO was forced to evacuate Beirut and leave Lebanon following an Israeli invasion in 1983. The Lebanese Civil War raged from 1975 to 90 and led to, among other things, the rise of the terrorist group Hezbollah as Iran became involved in the Shia community of Lebanon. In a nutshell, militant Islam could be said to have originated from various historical phenomena. The first is, as we've seen over the last few classes, the failure of secular Arab states. And what do we mean by failures? Well, the failures of secular Arab states in particular, and not just secular Arab states, but secular states with a majority Islamic population, such as those throughout Central Asia in the various stands that are of Turkic origin. These secular states failed for a number of reasons. First of all, they were uniformly autocratic. Their citizens were not given basic rights. Their citizens were not given basic opportunities. They were repressive. They denied fundamental human values to their population. So that was one failure. The second failure, of course, came in the post-war World War II era, when the rise of Israel, established largely with the help of the United States, but also with its allies, ejected many Palestinians from their homeland in the region that is now Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, and so on. And this galvanized the Arab world, who viewed it as a kind of second wave of colonialism. And so the secular Arab states, namely Syria, Jordan, Egypt, Iraq to a lesser extent, Lebanon to a lesser extent, fought several wars against Israel and lost each. So that really led to frustration and a realization that these governments were incapable of leading the Arab resistance movement. They were also incapable of creating Arab unity or Islamic unity, which is really what militant Islamists aspire to. So the idea is to reunite the Islamic world under this classical banner of the caliphate. So that's their political objective. Globalization has had a lot to do with the rise of Islamism, not just because globalization has pressured traditional values around the world. And you can see that in every Muslim country. There's a great conflict of the sort of colonialist model of women who are independent, women who are equal to men, for example, just the shift in gender roles and so on that globalization has continued to foster, economic developments, media developments, all of these things that we lump under the term globalization really means the conflict or the potential conflicts between a modern, forward-looking world and a more traditional conservative world that many Muslims espouse. In its most extreme form, and I stress in its most extreme form, this takes root as militant Islam. Now, historical causes that are more immediate and more obvious are a couple. First of all, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which drew fighters from around the Muslim world to the banner of these mujahideen, those who fight jihad in Central Asia against the communist, godless, atheistic Soviets. That was really a turning point in 1979 and onward. But after that, these groups faded from the scene, although they gained vast experience there, both combat and otherwise. They largely faded from the scene, worked behind the scenes until the 1990s, when really the first Gulf War brought them once again to the fore and sort of galvanized them, because that was another act of aggression. It was seen by a foreign Western state, in this case the United States, attacking an Arab Muslim country. First of all, before we go further, it's important to say that radical Islam has been always said by most talking heads and most scholars to be represented by less than 1% of Muslims worldwide. But I would go beyond that. I would say it's 99.9% of Muslims reject these positions. It's only a tiny, tiny handful of radicals that we're talking about. And it's important that we understand that Islam itself has very little to do with these radical positions held by the people that make the nightly news. Salafi Islam and Wahhabi Islam are often lumped together. They're not really the same thing. Wahhabi Islam is the state religion of Saudi Arabia. It is a puritanical form of Islam that, again, wants to return Islam to its roots. It's seen as largely reactionary, demands a respect for a very strict form of and a very punitive form of Sharia law that begins really with corporal punishment as a foundation for the legal code. Jihad in radical Islam, you see that laid out in your book. The greater jihad, the jihad of the self, the inner jihad, lesser jihad, the jihad of the body, of fighting the enemy, the infidel. It's actually not really quite true. I mean, jihad, the greater jihad has always really been stressed from the very beginning as the active jihad of fighting in the path, fi sabilillah, in the path of God. That means to go out and fight those unbelievers that bar the progress of Islam in the world. The best book on this is David Cook's book on jihad, which I encourage you to look at if you're more interested in this, who traces a whole historical development through the Arabic texts on what jihad really means and how it changes over the centuries. Jihad, though, broadly is defensive. That is, it's defensive warfare, even if it is preemptive. It is to be waged in expectation of future threats, for example, against the community. It's fought to preserve the community from physical, temporal threats to the Ummah, that is, the Muslim community. And jihad today is seen by many, and I think it's fair to see it that way, as a response to decades of abuse, neglect and marginalization of Muslims at home and on the world stage. And again, this has a lot to do with the fact that most Muslim Arab states, or all Muslim Arab states actually, with rare exception, maybe we could say Lebanon, but until the Arab Spring were universally autocracies with tyrannical rulers and no real civil rights. And of course, that I think goes a long way to explaining the repression that creates the environment in which these kind of views can flourish. Jihadis overall aim to unify the Muslim world in a new caliphate. The first was destroyed by the Mongols in the 13th century, and its successor, which was taken up by the Ottoman Turks, was abolished by Kemal Ataturk in 1924. So there's been no caliph of Islam since 1924. The goal is to establish a state that would be powerful enough to proclaim a caliphate. Although people have proclaimed themselves caliphs, they've never had any kind of substantial political power. So take a real nation state with significant political power to declare and prosecute a caliphate. You can still see today that the large Muslim diaspora, that includes Turks in Germany, in France, it's North Africans, Maghrebis, that it would be Algerians, Moroccans, Tunisians, face great discrimination, bad working conditions, bad living conditions, bigotry in the workplace. They live in slums, and it's not much better elsewhere throughout Europe. There's a great sort of cultural friction between supposed Western humanist values and the way they treat outsiders. I mentioned obviously the failure of secular groups like the PLO and Palestine, People for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, to deliver victory in the Palestine question in the war against Israel. So these secular groups had their say, they had their chance. These were Marxist groups based on, again, a Western philosophy and largely not Islamic, although they had Islamic undercurrents, and they failed. And so that failed effort reflects on this generation, and they have been rejected by the younger generation of jihadi fighters. I mentioned also, and it's worth stressing, the autocratic nature of these Arab states, some of which I list here, but that would conclude, again, up until 2011, the Arab Spring, virtually every state in the Middle East and North Africa. The response, of course, to hostility to Israel, which is seen as a neo-colonial enterprise, a thieving state, a crusader state as it's often called. The Zionists and Crusaders lump Israel and the U.S. in bed together in what the Palestinians and other Muslims view as an unholy alliance. And this triggers radical Islamic response. Radical Muslims often believe they have, or they always believe, they have a unique and the only correct understanding of Allah and His will. A jihad against unbelievers is central to living the faith. It really is at the top of all the pillars in their view, even though it's not one of the all. Sunni radicalism, as I mentioned, the 1979 Soviet invasion of Afghanistan was a major turning point. It drew fighters from all around the Islamic world, from Central Asia, the Indian subcontinent, all the way to the Maghreb and North Africa. A lot of Egyptians fought in this campaign. And of course, in this, they were encouraged by the United States and especially Saudi Arabia. This was a plan by the United States government to make the Soviet Union bleed the way we had bled in Vietnam. It was seen as an opportunity to greatly weaken the Soviet Union during the Cold War through proxy warfare. And again, it was the Saudis were happy to rid their country of their radical elements by sending them off to fight and hopefully, from their perspective, to die fighting the Soviets, at least to keep them out of the country. And they're also happy to pay for it. Basically, they matched U.S. contributions to the war dollar for dollar. During and after the war, the Saudis also were building influence in Pakistan and throughout Central Asia through the establishment of Muslim schools, Muslim madrasas that would teach Wahhabi Islam, which again, the Islam that the Saudi state wants to, throughout Indonesia and elsewhere in Asia, that they want to establish, of course, is Wahhabi Islam, because this, they feel, gives the Saudi state the most long reach and the most influence over the Muslim communities abroad. Some representative groups of Sunni radicalism: Hamas, al-Qaeda, of course, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Boko Haram, Jabhat al-Nusra, and many others. Of these, al-Qaeda distinguishes itself for its global reach. These others to this point are really local or regional groups with local or regional aims. Jabhat al-Nusra is perhaps the most local at this point. Their goal is simply the overthrow of the Assad regime in Syria. Shiite radicalism was a lot later in developing. There were obviously developments of Shiite radicals influenced by Marxism in the 1970s, but it really took the Iranian Revolution of 1979 that brought the Ayatollah Khomeini into power, that swept away these Marxist elements of Iranian society, that destroyed the power of the Shah, who was a conservative, right-wing autocrat, and eliminated the credibility of the United States within Iranian society and Western influences in Iranian society that allowed the Revolutionary Guards of Iran to spread a distinctive Shiite form of radicalism. And it took even longer, and it depended on Lebanese clerics, to create a tremendous leap for Shia Muslims, which was the use of suicide attacks. Excuse me, the Iranians, up until very, very recently, were never associated with suicide attacks. That has finally changed under, again, Lebanese Shiite Hezbollah influence. Shiite radicalism is really often directed in operations to punish the United States for perceived misdeeds. For example, not long ago, there was an Iranian attack allegedly on the Saudi ambassador to the United States, foiled in New York City. And this kind of operation is the sort of thing that would cause embarrassment to the Iranian government and then lead them to retaliate through their proxies, mainly Hezbollah, which they've done in the past. So far, though, efforts to radicalize through propaganda of the deed, through these spectacular terrorist attacks like 9/11, Khobar Towers, and so on, they've failed, because mainstream Muslims do not want to, they're not violent, and they don't want a violent world. And so this call to jihad has really fallen on largely deaf ears. Hamas operates in Gaza, which is here in the eastern Mediterranean, on the southwestern coast by Israel. It's officially part of the Palestinian territories. It's only a tiny strip of land, 25 miles long. 6 to 12 miles wide, depending on where you are. You see Gaza City there in the upper part of the map on the left. And such a small territory has a very large population of 1.5 million Palestinians. Founded in 1987, Hamas is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Egyptian fundamentalist revivalist movement we'll talk a little bit about. Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya, or the Islamic Resistance Movement, is the longer name of the group. Hamas means simply zeal. In 1988, it published its Covenant of the Islamic Resistance Movement, which you have in your Voices of Your book. One of the founding members was Sheikh Yassin, who died in 2004. He had been a quadriplegic since the age of 12, and he was a spiritual leader and co-founder, along with Abdulaziz al-Rantisi. Al-Rantisi focused on charitable work and humanitarian assistance, which was one of the things that really set Hamas apart from, say, the PLO. PLO did not have the sustained fundamental human element that Hamas began with, which was schools, hospitals, feeding the hungry, taking care of orphans, taking care of widows. These were the sorts of things that really established Hamas and gave them the foothold within the Palestinian community. Interestingly, it was Sheikh Yassin and his followers who pioneered the use of suicide attacks in Israel, which was a shocking and new form of terror activity, the use of suicide belts on buses and in restaurants and so on. Visited the scenes of several of these attacks, and today the scars are still quite deep from the Hamas suicide attack campaign that has, of course, led to the building of the security fence by the Israeli state. It's one of the things that justifies a lot of the strong-arm tactics of the Israeli government as they seek to defend their citizenry. I actually talked to the Shin Bet, that is Israeli intelligence interrogator, who interrogated Sheikh Yassin, when he was incarcerated by the Israeli state. Finally, he was broken and gave in and gave over a lot of intelligence and a lot of his fellow operatives to the Israeli state. But Hamas remains a formidable and powerful enemy of the Israeli government, and the democratically elected body that controls Gaza and has split the Palestinian territories in their governance. So the West Bank is really controlled by Fatah, the old PLO and its representatives, while Gaza is controlled by Hamas. Also, you hear a lot of talking heads and people that claim to know what they're talking about. It's a Sunni-Shia divide, Sunni-Shia, they're at each other's throats. Well, Hamas is actually a partner of Iran, the most powerful Shia state in the region, and also a partner of Hezbollah, the Iranian Shia proxy, even though Hamas itself is a radical Sunni organization. Iran provides the weaponry. Hamas uses the rockets that they fire into Israel and so on. This is provided by Iran. So, stop and think when you hear these generalizations. On to al-Qaeda, which is a larger and obviously sort of global entity, which has a totally opposite focus. It is to attack both apostate Muslim states, but also to strike at the United States, whom they seem as the guiding hand behind all of these Arab autocrats. And in many ways, they're right. I mean, we stand behind the Saudi royal family. The United States obviously backs King Abdullah of Jordan. We did back, until his overthrow, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, one of the most brutal dictators in the Middle East. Ben Ali of Tunisia was one of our guys. I mean, this is what causes problems for us worldwide. Pursuing what we have done, which is a policy of realpolitik. It is pursuing your interests in a realistic manner that has caused some of these reactions. Since September 11, al-Qaeda has been under attack by the United States and dozens of Western nations. and of course what President Bush famously called the global war on terror. Al-Qaeda is the base in Arabic. At the end of his life, Osama bin Laden, of course, our pal showing up on the right-hand corner, felt that Al-Qaeda needed the word jihad to be put in there because it wasn't able to recruit effectively because its brand name had not included the struggle in its name. It's founded by bin Laden in 1988. He's a construction magnate in Saudi. His father had reconstructed for one the Kaaba, had refurbished it for the Saudi government, and had a lot of lucrative Saudi contracts. And of course, I think everyone knows that al-Qaeda conducted the most devastating terrorist attack on U.S. soil in history, with the Twin Towers attacks, the hijacking over Pennsylvania, and the attack on the Pentagon being really the pinnacle of their operations to this point. Bin Laden himself was born in 1957 in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. In 1979, he graduated with a degree in civil engineering from Abdulaziz University in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and then headed immediately to Afghanistan to fight among the Mujahideen, the jihadi fighters fighting the Soviet Union. The Soviets intervened in Afghanistan to support the Marxist government of Hafizullah Amin, replacing him with Babrak Kemal, and basically every Soviet prime minister that was installed met a horrific end during or after the Soviet occupation. The Soviets tried to nation build in Afghanistan. They never committed as many ground troops as, say, we did in Vietnam or the French did in Algeria, but it was a significant Soviet effort to pacify and prop up what they viewed as an important region on their southern flank. Remember that at this time the Soviet Union controls all of what is now the Central Asian stands of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and so on. These are all in the Soviet Empire. As the Soviet war is winding down in Afghanistan, it's the year that the Soviets pull out. Bin Laden goes back to Saudi Arabia, but he suddenly, he doesn't get along well with the Saudi government. There's pressure on him, and there's finally a breaking point that follows with the 1990 invasion of Kuwait by the Iraqi state. Bin Laden tells the Saudi government he can defend the kingdom from the Iraqi military with his Mujahideen fighters, and the Saudis basically laugh at him and then call George Bush and the United States and its coalition allies roll in and base themselves in Saudi Arabia. This is the turning point in bin Laden's, it's certainly not his views, but in his operational conduct, where he decides that the United States is the primary enemy, that they're the real cause of all this mess, and that they have to be attacked directly. And as early as 1992, his group is bombing the U.S. In Yemen, then in Sudan. From Sudan, his base in Sudan, there's the first attempt on the World Trade Center with a car bomb in the basement of the World Trade Center. These are directed by Laden's group. He's ejected under U.S. pressure from Sudan in '96. And it's the same year that Bill Clinton, who's apprised of the seriousness of the threat, authorizes lethal force in an executive order against bin Laden. We have bin Laden in our sights a couple times in the late 90s with special forces teams, but never do we pull the trigger because it would have meant civilian deaths, the death of his families, and also the death of, at least on one occasion, sheikhs from the Gulf countries who are ostensibly U.S. allies. So they didn't want it messy. They wanted to be perfectly clean, and we missed our opportunities under Clinton to assassinate bin Laden. 1996, bin Laden issues his famous declaration of jihad against the United States, and he provides fair warning that we're now at war with him and that we should expect attack, and he tells us why. His goals are to drive the United States from the Arabian Peninsula, free the holy sites of Mecca and Medina from the pollution of the infidel Americans, to overthrow the Saudi government and to liberate, as I mentioned, the Muslim holy sites, as well as to then support Islamic revolutionary activity around the world and reestablish the caliphate and spread Islam globally. The 1998 bombings, bloody affairs in Kenya and Tanzania left hundreds dead, thousands wounded, and first really brought home the capabilities of al-Qaeda. Nevertheless, despite this, and despite having knowledge of having good intelligence from several governments around the world, incompetence came to rule the order of the day. We did not catch the September 11th hijackers, and of course, I think you know the story. Almost 3,000 dead in those attacks. And then on October 7th, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. Our costs to date, 2,144 killed, 17,674 servicemen wounded, and $635 billion spent in the war. We invaded Iraq, 20th of March 2003, for its ostensible weapons of mass destructions, which were never uncovered, and Saddam Hussein's non-existent links to al-Qaeda. U.S. losses in that war, 4,486 killed, 32,223 wounded, and a war cost of $813 billion. Al-Qaeda still maintains a loose affiliation with groups around the world, some of whom you see on the screen. There are others that have at one time or another come into the Al-Qaeda orbit, and they range from everything from groups in the Philippines, such as Abu Sayyaf, Jamaat Islamiyya in Southeast Asia, to the Islamic movement of Uzbekistan, and so on. So it still has a global reach. It's been badly undermined by the global war on terror. Death of bin Laden on 1st of May 2011 was a U.S. victory, but I would argue largely symbolic. Bin Laden didn't really have firm control and never did over the organization. The organization itself, to call it an organization is it's not the best word. It's a syndicate of loosely affiliated groups that are largely independent, that conduct independent strategic operations and have independent tactics and independent funding, often from the main supposed hierarchy of al-Qaeda. So it is almost like a loosely grouped franchise. The U.S. response obviously has been massive. If you think at the war on terror, think about what we've done. We've overhauled our government, created new cabinet-level department, Homeland Security, gargantuan military responses, that is, wars in 2 countries, interventions in many other countries, expansion of U.S. bases into formerly hostile countries like Algeria, for example, where we have drone bases and intelligence posts. Unthinkable 30 years ago. The Patriot Act and similar draconian laws that have curbed American civil liberties. Airport searches and security, the NSA cases of intercepting all electronics data, the new U.S. data center in Utah that's going to allegedly have the capability of intercepting and storing every single piece of electronic data generated in this country, possibly abroad. It's kind of makes one wonder and say, well, who won the war? Terrorism, for the first time, it's a global concern. You can't find a Western country without a major anti-terrorism presence. Militarily big business, and it's great business for jihadis. I'm thinking here of the Haqqani network, the Haqqani Nexus, as it's called, in the Pakistan tribal territories. That really, it's flourishing. Its main occupation is to recruit and to fund and to make money off the jihad business. And business is good.